travelers, and welcome to Go See, Do, Explore.
Here, we dive deep into the heart of travel, sharing hidden gems, unforgettable experiences, and the stories that make each destination unique.
Whether you're a seasoned traveler or dreaming of your next getaway, you're in the right place to get inspired.
I'm Christopher.
And I'm Ashleigh.
And together, we'll set the course for your next great adventure and discover the stories that make each place unforgettable.
It's time to go, see, and do more. Let's explore. Hello, everybody. We are back for another episode of Go See, Do, Explore. And this time we are talking about how to avoid crowds when you travel.
Yeah, we've traveled to some busy destinations and also have planned some trips away from busy destinations. And I think we've got some tips that are helpful.
Yeah. In the words of Rick Steves, popular places are popular for a reason. And so there are some tips to still get to experience those world famous destinations without waiting hours in line with 5,000 of your closest friends.
Yeah, at least as little as possible.
Right. So the first tip we have is to travel off season.
Oh, that'd be nice.
I know I've mentioned before that we are stuck to the school schedule. So, you know, the week between Christmas and New Year's is probably one of the most busy times of the whole year to travel. We pretty much travel during that time every year.
Yeah.
So later in this, we will talk about ways to minimize crowds even when you're traveling in the busy season. But the biggest tip is to try to avoid it if possible.
And we have taken trips, like short trips off season, definitely, like long weekends. Mm-hmm. And so you can look for that too, because it may be that the place that you want to go is totally doable as a 4-day trip or something like that. You might be able to do the things you want to do off season, even if you can't take a week-long trip.
And then outside of that Christmas week, July and August tend to be the most busy in the summer. That's why in the past few years, we've taken our big summer trips in June. It's busier, but it's not peak.
Yeah, depending on where you are, school might not be out yet in June and things like that.
Yeah, this past trip when we went to Italy, I was literally done with school on Friday and we got on an airplane on Sunday. I was not wasting any of that precious June.
Yeah.
If you're able to travel November, February, those are typically lower crowds pretty much everywhere, aside from, which we'll talk about in a second, but aside from in the US, you've got Thanksgiving weekend is a bigger travel time because people have time off. And then also in, like I mentioned, in February, President's Day weekend is a busy one. And you can go back to our Disney World recap if you don't believe me on that one.
Is October good? October doesn't really have any holidays.
Yeah, October can be a pretty good time. Less, the summer crowds have died down.
Unless you're going to like a Halloween destination, but it's not, Halloween travel's not really a thing.
No, I don't think so. January,
like second and third week.
Yeah, once the kids are back in school after New Year's, the beginning of January up until, once again in the US, Martin Luther King weekend is a big travel time, but if you avoid those. And so this kind of bleeds into our next tip, which is to avoid holidays. I've mentioned some of the US holidays that are busier travel days. If possible, go to busier destinations during the week. Museums and things like that tend to be busier on weekends when people that have to work are free. And then if you're traveling somewhere that has a festival and you're not traveling for the festival, I would avoid it at that time. Mm-hmm. We talk a lot about Traverse City being one of our favorite places. We avoid it like the plague during Cherry Festival.
I don't know about the plague, but...
I know, that's just not my thing. If you wanted to go for the Cherry Festival, obviously go. Just be aware that it's going to be insanely busy. Even if you're going to Disney, visiting during a weekday is noticeably different for crowds versus weekends and holidays.
Yeah. Flights too, I mean, that's maybe more of a price thing, but it's also because of availability, right? Like you'll probably have a better chance of finding a flight at a reasonable price on a weekday or something like that.
I feel like they used to say one of the old adages was like Wednesday is the
It can be. I mean, at any given point, there is a cheapest day, of course, but it's much more random than it used to be because everything's all computerized now with the pricing and all that. There used to be a dude that like changed the prices, and yeah, a lot of those trends are just much more subtle and much more changeable now. Another thing you can consider, something that we've done a fair amount, is if there's not a particular destination you have your heart set on, look and see where else you might go, places that are a little bit more off the beaten path. There's never really been a better time than now in terms of our ability to research those kinds of destinations. And, you can find, of course, everyone in the winter, in the holiday week likes to go warm places. We do that too a lot of times. But hey, maybe you want to go somewhere that's colder but not a ski destination or something like that.
Well, one example that I can think of is, a few years ago we did our big Out West National Park road trip, and Yellowstone was crazy busy. Glacier National Park, crazy busy. And then we spent a week in North Dakota at Theodore Roosevelt National Park. And that can be busy, but it's not nearly as busy as Yellowstone. And then you want to take it even farther. We went to the Elkhorn Ranch unit of Theodore Roosevelt National Park, and we were literally the only people there.
Yeah, that's a good example. And yeah, there are places that are great to go that are not known or not known yet. And just by doing some research, you can find them and they might have everything you want. I know someone that is actually, I think this coming week, going to like on a beach vacation in Croatia. And, everyone goes to Italy, but Croatia is just on the other side of the same water, and is getting expensive now, but is not as crowded as Italy, certainly.
And then also, if you're wanting a kind of city vacation, look at those second cities. So, a couple summers ago, we went to Portugal. We spent time in Lisbon, but then we also went to Porto, which was much less crowded. I mean, Lisbon isn't that crowded compared to other European cities even, but Porto is even less so than that. And on our last trip, we spent time in Bologna, which is, I wouldn't say a second city, especially because Italy has so many big cities, but it's much less busy with tourists than Rome or Florence or Venice. So another tip that we have, and this is one that we've probably talked about before, especially when it came to our Disney trip. This was a travel tip that I picked up early in my Disney days, and it really does apply to pretty much any kind of travel. And that is get out early, stay out late, and then in the middle of the day, go back and kind of relax and recharge. And this is a huge tip if you're planning on visiting Disney World, especially in the heat of the summer. You want to get there for a rope drop, and then you want to be there at the end of the day after the fireworks and everybody leaves. Those are the two best times with the lowest crowds and the lowest wait times. But this also applies when you're visiting hot destinations in the summer. We totally did this in Europe. If you're going to busy destinations, you just can't sleep in and expect to avoid the crowds. You have to get up early. I mean, you can still sleep in, especially if you've got a lot of time, fine, sleep in, but then you're going to be visiting the David with everyone else. Mm-hmm. So getting out early, kind of taking a break in the middle of the day, take your siesta, if you will, and then go back out late. You'll kind of have the cities to yourself. And then there's also, when it comes to popular restaurants, if you check Google, a lot of times on Google, you can see the popular times in kind of like a bell curve, and you can know how to kind of avoid those times that way.
Definitely. Another thing we've done before too, sometimes on purpose, sometimes just out of happenstance, is to eat a little bit off the peak times. Depending on where you are, the peak times vary, and you can find that out. But you can use that same Google technique too to look at when people are eating. I wouldn't recommend necessarily you eat hours and hours off of what people are eating, because you're going to have strange experiences probably, or restaurants won't even be open maybe. But
the kitchen isn't open yet, but you could have your drinks.
Yeah. But yeah, just eat an hour earlier or an hour later, or just be a little bit flexible. Maybe, sometimes when we travel, we will tend towards like 2 big meals rather than 3 smaller meals, just out of timing. A lot of times it takes a while to eat sometimes. And so it's easier just to do 2 bigger meals. But in any case, yeah, just kind of pay attention and you can find a spot where the crowds might be a little bit less. Or the other thing with this too is don't eat where all the tourists are eating.
Right.
Eat where the locals are eating. And the locals might be eating at a different time than the tourists, depending on where you are. But yeah, I mean, just a little bit of reading, a little bit of research, and you can figure out kind of where people go, or ask around even, if you're so inclined.
This kind of blends into my next tip here, and that's to read an actual paper guidebook. There is so much information available on the internet these days, but not all of it is reliable. So get an actual paper guidebook. If you don't want to buy them, your library, I'm sure, has them. And you'll have an expert opinion on where's the best place to stay, where's the best neighborhood. A lot of times these experts will have tips on avoiding crowds in a specific destination. I think it's time for a wine break.
Okay, let's go to the wine break. Here for the wine break, we have another Michigan wine. No surprise that we have plenty of Michigan wine around here. This one is Bubbling Rosé. It is a sparkling rosé wine. It smells very, very fruity, would you say?
Yeah, I would definitely say strawberry on the nose.
It's really nice. Like, it's hot today. It's like a hot summer wine. But
We're not drinking it hot, to be clear.
Oh, yeah.
The wine is chilled.
The wine is chilled. This is from Fen Valley Vineyards, which is in the southwest corner of Michigan. We've talked about Lake Michigan Shore before, one of Michigan's 5 AVAs. This is from Fenville. Fenville AVA is this little chunk of Lake Michigan Shore, but it's its own AVA. I think the soil is different. I think that's the main characteristic that makes it different from the larger Lake Michigan Shore AVA. But Fenville, it's called Fenville because the city of Fenville is kind of in the middle of it. And this is Fen Valley, which, as you can imagine, the name is related. A couple of wineries in Fenville, not a ton. It's a small area. But Fen Valley is one of the more known ones, and we've been there a couple times. We've bought a couple bottles, actually, of this bubbling rosé. This is not new to us. What do you think?
It's definitely fruity. It's dry but fruity. I know a lot of times people get kind of confused and they'll taste the fruit and assume that it's sweet. But this is not a sweet wine, although it does say semi-dry.
It's semi-dry. It's got a little bit of residual sugar. I would not by any means describe it as sweet, though.
But it's very fruity. Maybe some cherry.
It says avoid shaking on the bottle. The other thing to remember with sparkling wine is you lose a little bit of the sugar. Your ability to taste a little bit of sugar is lost from the effervescence, like the sparkling aspect of it. So it always is going to seem a little drier than it is when it's sparkling. We don't know much about this wine. There's not much on the bottle. It doesn't say what grapes or anything like that. But it is bottled by LP Champy in Suttons Bay. Do you think that's related to Mobby? Do you think Champy is like a Mobby alter ego or something? Because Mobby does a ton of sparkling work for other.
LP feels like Leelanau Peninsula.
Leelanau Peninsula, Champy. Okay, we have some research to do.
But it's a really nice kind of dark pink color.
Yeah.
It's nice.
A lot of times when you see a rosé that's this color, this like almost red color, it's made using what's called the Sanier method, which refers to like bleeding, right? And what they do is they make red wine, and to make the red wine a little bit more intense in color, a few days into the process, they siphon off some of the juice. And so the red becomes a darker red, and then you get a rosé out of what you siphon off. And so a lot of times, it's not a sure thing, but a lot of times when you see a rosé that's this color, that's what it is. It's the Sanier method.
But yeah, this is a really nice, easy drinking, kind of refreshing wine for the summer.
Yep. That's the wine break. We're back from the wine break. Our next tip is to try to buy tickets for things online in advance. It's very often the case now that there are two lines when you go to a popular place. There's a line to buy tickets, and then there's a line to enter if you already have tickets. Or some variation of that. So the point is, if you buy your tickets online in advance, many times now you can enter a much shorter or maybe non-existent line. We've done this several times in several different locations. It's been a great way to get into places relatively quickly. The one caveat I'll give here is make sure you're paying attention. Like, are you booking this ticket from the place itself, or is this some sort of like a third party scam? Not necessarily a real scam. Sometimes there are third party brokers that basically charge you extra for no additional value, or you have to kind of watch out for that. But if you pay attention, you should be fine.
Yeah, definitely first go to whatever venue you were looking for a ticket for. So go to the museum itself first. Sometimes with very popular destinations, they will book up pretty far in advance. This is something that's kind of surprised us in our Europe touring the last 2 years, the last 2 summers. I looked for the Royal Palace, a tour of the Royal Palace of Madrid 1 day in advance, and there were 0 tickets. Now, we could have still stood and waited in the 95-degree heat for an opening, but instead I found us a guided tour, and the tour ended up being great. Like, I found one that was rated really well, and I did the same for the Accademia in Florence. That I looked about a week in advance, and all of the tickets were gone for like the whole summer. I don't know at what point I was supposed to have made that reservation. But so I definitely recommend looking for tickets well in advance. And then if they're not available and you still want to skip the line, consider a tour, because both times that we've done it, the tours have really added to our understanding of the place.
Definitely. A counter example to that was when we purchased tickets for the Vaporetto in Venice, which is not an attraction, obviously, but you can buy it online a bunch of places and they all charged a certain amount of money or whatever. And ultimately with those, you still just had to go to the machine and scan your voucher, or you could just go to the machine, and I think it was cheaper. So, I mean, that's sort of the thing to watch out for, is like, is this really a good idea? But it usually is. It usually is a good idea.
Oh, and when you're looking to buy your tickets in advance, kind of go back to that earlier tip about starting early or staying late. So when we did Pina Palace in Sintra, for example, I got the earliest ticket that I could get because it gets very busy there during the day. And then recently, a few episodes ago, we talked about our time in Florence, and I found through a guidebook that the Uffizi was open late on Tuesdays. So I booked us a ticket, an entry time after the regular museum hours were over.
I always feel like I'm doing something right when I'm leaving as everyone else is arriving, or if I'm arriving as everyone else is leaving. I always feel like, yep, we did this right. Whenever that happens.
Yes. Especially when it's hot out. You don't want to be spending your vacation standing in the hot sun in the summer. That's just not fun. So do a little bit of research and buy your tickets in advance. Find out what attractions offer advance purchase and buy them in advance. Now, another one of our tips that we've talked about quite a lot, because we utilize this in Italy for sure, and that is booking a place to stay in a less touristy part of town. So we did this when we were in Lisbon. We stayed in the Alfama area, which is the old part of Lisbon, the part that actually was the only part that survived from that earthquake in the 1700s, and it's just not a tourist destination. It's where the people of Lisbon live. We did this in Florence when we stayed at the Ultra Arno. We did this in Naples when we stayed in the Spanish Quarter. And it's just a way to leave the crowds behind and kind of stay somewhere a little quieter.
Yeah. Of course, do your research. Find out where are good places to be and where, maybe you wouldn't want to stay. But I think if you're someone that can get past needing like 4-star amenities, which, if you can't, you should work on that.
Work on your resiliency, people.
But no, I'm sure everyone listening to this is all good with like a decent, Airbnb type situations. But we've done it with both Airbnbs and hotels, to be clear. If you want to experience like the real part of a place, New Orleans too, right? We stayed in New Orleans. We stayed in like a regular residential part of the city, and look into your transit options, look into how long it's going to take you to get places, look into like, is there food there, things like that. But it's been a good way to travel.
And if you are looking at an Airbnb and you're worried about kind of going in the less touristy part and it not being a safe part of town, the reviews on Airbnb will tell you. If the host might not be so forthcoming about how safe the neighborhood is, the reviewers, the people that have stayed there, if they think it's a little sketchy, they will let you know in the reviews.
Yeah.
Now, I feel like this next one is one that you're just not allowed to say.
Oh, no.
This is a me tip.
I don't know if I agree with this one, but go for it.
Sometimes, especially in the busy middle of the day, avoid public transportation if you're trying to avoid crowds. Now, I'm not saying
that's true.
I'm not saying public transportation is always bad, but in the middle of the day, in rush hour traffic, public transportation is going to be uncomfortable.
Yeah. The thing is, I mean, you're right, but traffic congestion is also a crowd, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, you're not amongst people, but you're also, like, maybe the tip is also just try to avoid big traveling efforts while everyone is traveling. I think I could get on board with that. Like, I think about when we were in Paris, right? And we were trying to get a ride for, like, forever, and we couldn't get a ride. And then we got on the subway and we got there, right? Like, it was, so. And it wasn't even that crowded on the subway.
It's true. It's true.
I know what you're saying, though.
If your goal is to avoid crowds, avoiding public transportation is probably going to be part of that plan. Yeah. But as you said, when we were in Paris, coming back after it was kind of an early dinner, there was nobody else on the subway. Mm-hmm. So that was not a busy time. But then, I think also about that time we were in Naples after coming back from Pompeii, and like we were being pushed all over the place. Like I could have used an Uber in that moment.
Yeah, that was really busy.
That lady that pushed me to try to get ahead of me, and I was just standing my ground. I'm like, you are not getting ahead of me, lady, with your giant suitcase.
Yeah.
And she, we went through. We ended up on the same train, and then we got off. We got off at the same station at the exact same time. I was like, did the pushing help you, lady?
Yeah, she cut in front of me.
Yeah, I was tougher. I was like, no, I got my elbows out. Don't push me, lady.
Another tip, we talked about this when we talked about Venice, is to find an off the beaten path tour or a private guide. People can take you to less touristy, less crowded places in a city, and we've done that a couple times, and it's always been fun. Yeah,
it was a great way to see Venice. There were definitely places we wouldn't have gone otherwise. And then also, if you want to, you kind of mentioned it, but if you want to really see the locals' perspective, you can hire a private guide, and they'll take you around and they'll help you avoid the crowds in a way that it's hard to do as a traveler, as a tourist. Now, this next one doesn't apply to every destination, but if you are traveling to a destination that receives cruise ships, be aware of the cruise ship schedules. So one example of this is Old San Juan. It's one of our absolute favorite places, but it can be a madhouse zoo on a day that a cruise ship is there. And we're cruise people. It was uncomfortable. It was hard to walk in the streets.
Yeah, the last time we were there was really, I think we maybe talked about this on another episode, but the last time we were there was really telling because we were there for 2 days. One had, I think, 3 ships, and the other had 0 ships. Mm-hmm. And it was like, holy cow, the difference. Mm-hmm. You could really just feel it the whole time. And I mean, it's just kind of a reality that you have to work around, but maybe you can work around it. Maybe you can, if you're staying in Old San Juan for a couple of days and one of those is a heavy cruise day, maybe that's the day that you're taking a little trip somewhere else or something,
You could get out on the water that day or go to the rainforest that day. Mm-hmm. But some other destinations that we have been that this is also important to know: Bar Harbor, Maine, Key West, Florida, and then the Caribbean. But I feel like
it's different.
It's different when you're in the little Caribbean.
The number of tourists from cruises relative to not from cruises in those Caribbean islands is just a little bit of a different game.
I don't think
we've never been to those places, not on a boat, so I don't know what it's like.
It's true.
We've been the problem.
We've been the problem people.
Yeah. Another tip to help avoid crowds, especially as you're traveling, is to use TSA PreCheck and mobile passport or global entry if you have it. TSA PreCheck allows you to go to a separate line, at least most of the time.
Sometimes you go to the regular line and you hold the sign that says I have TSA PreCheck. Sometimes they just stick you in the regular line and they're like, just go over there. Yeah. I don't want to deal with you.
But yeah, you almost all the time. You go through a expedited screening that has a lot less people. And now I'll shamelessly plug Delta. Delta, if you fly certain airports, Detroit Metro being one of them, and you have TSA PreCheck, you can go through their like Delta ID, or I can't remember what they're calling it now. I did this just once about a month and a half ago, and you get to skip even the TSA PreCheck line. You get to cut ahead of the PreCheck people, and then you just stand in front of a computer and they know your name and say, go on. And like, you don't show them anything. It was crazy. But in any case, yeah, TSA PreCheck was really helpful. It's really inexpensive. It's $85 currently for 5 years. So,
I mean,
deal.
I really feel like if you travel more than twice a year,
Yeah.
PreCheck is worth it.
I would honestly do it once. Like, I mean,
Yeah, if you're going to travel, 5 times in 5 years,
Yeah.
$85, it's so much less hassle. We travel with a lot of electronics, and so it's just a huge hassle to have to take all that stuff out of the bag. You don't have to take your shoes off. Sometimes I've heard people complain that the line is getting just as long as the regular TSA line. And if that's the case, the screening goes so much faster because everybody's not taking everything out of their bag. Oh, you don't have to take your liquids out.
I haven't experienced that. The lines, I mean, I've flown 20 times this year, and I have not once seen the PreCheck line remotely as long. The only time I can say that is if they both have like 2 people in it. That's the only time it's like...
I have traveled Detroit in the Evans terminal where the PreCheck line is longer than the regular line, but that's because the signage isn't good and everyone gets in the PreCheck line and they're like, you don't have PreCheck, you need to go over there, so it takes longer.
Yeah, Detroit Evans terminal, fix your signage. It's not good.
It's not good. But you also kind of mentioned Mobile Passport, which is an app that is free.
You have to have a U.S. passport.
If you have a U.S. passport, Mobile Passport app can expedite the customs process. We have not really ever been through customs at a time when this was necessary.
No. Well, Metro doesn't, they don't do it. Not every airport does it. Not every international airport supports it.
But I think most of the big ones do. We did it when we were in Newark, but then there were 2 people ahead of us and they didn't even have
the mobile passport lane
line.
wasn't open.
But I guess both times that we've landed internationally in the last 2 years, there have been big weather events that have canceled a lot of other flights, and we just happened to get lucky enough to land. So I don't know if that probably plays into it. But then Chris also mentioned global entry. And if you're someone that travels internationally a lot, I believe it is the same 5-year period as PreCheck, and it includes PreCheck, but it's similar to Mobile Passport.
There's just like these like passport kiosks, automated kiosks you go to.
So our last tip to avoid crowds is to pack light. You can avoid the crowds at the airport if you don't have to get in line to check a bag. You can avoid the crowds in the airport when you don't have to go to the carousel to retrieve your bag. Mm-hmm. So going carry-on only can really help you avoid crowds.
Yeah.
So yeah, those are our tips to help you avoid crowds while still traveling and still seeing the places that you want to see. For our final segment of this episode, we wanted to talk about a place that we visited, and that is Sitka, Alaska.
Yeah, it's southern Alaska, right?
Yeah, southeast Alaska, but it's on the Pacific side of the...
Right, the Inside Passage.
The Inside Passage, thank you. Where most of the cruise destinations are inside the Inside Passage. Sitka is just a little bit different, and I think it's really cool, and it's a place I feel like a lot of people, even people that do Alaska cruises, don't necessarily know about.
Yeah.
Sitka, Alaska is a temperate rainforest, and so the climate is pretty much the same all year round. The entire island of Sitka is also a big landslide risk.
Yeah.
They told us when we were in Sitka that they had some geologists out to study to see where are safer places to live after there was a big landslide. And the geologist came back and said, nowhere. But it is a very beautiful place. And it is home to 3 really cool destinations that we want to talk about.
Yes. The first one we want to talk about is the Fortress of the Bear. The Fortress of the Bear it was someone's project, basically, to help bears in Alaska because, bears and humans don't always get along. Humans are almost always to blame there. But, sometimes bears have to be euthanized because they've had bad contact with humans and are basically then spoiled and we're only going to be a menace. The problem with that, there are many problems with that, but one of the problems with that is if it's a mother bear and she has cubs, those cubs will not survive in the wild. And so they've typically euthanized the cubs too, just because otherwise they're going to, die of starvation or something like that. Fortress of the Bear started years ago by a forest ranger who was sick of this, started to basically take in these cubs and keep them in captivity. In Alaska, bears cannot be rehabilitated and re-released. It's against the law there. There are some states, interestingly enough, where they've found ways of doing this, and I know that they're advocating for a legislation change in Alaska too. You'd think if anywhere in the world, you'd think Alaska, you could drop a bear a couple thousand miles from anyone. But because I think, like they said, Wyoming, maybe some other places, Montana had, they were able to successfully rehabilitate and release these bears under certain conditions. But Fortress of the Bear keeps these bears, takes care of them. Sometimes they end up going to zoos, things like that. But it was a really cool place to go see some bears, and they're doing good things there too.
Yeah, it's a really interesting place, and their mission is great. I heard some people figuring out ways to sneak in without paying, and I just yeah, this is not a place where you want to try to save a buck, help this organization out. And even in the show notes, I'll put a link to them in the chance that someone hearing this wants to donate to this cause, because it is a great cause, and it is awful that these bears have to be euthanized and that there's no other alternative. Mm-hmm. So the Fortress of the Bear is great for that. And it was really cool. We got to see the bears at feeding time. We got to see them be really active. Yeah, it was just a wildlife experience that we don't often get. And it is still kind of zoo-like. They are in captivity, but they're not bred in captivity or anything like that. They're in captivity as a alternative to killing them.
Right. Yeah, so, they're in captivity, but they're still alive.
Right. And it's interesting because Fortress of the Bear, originally, they had these big, were they used for paper milling or something like that? These big drums.
Yeah, it was something like the pulping, right?
Yeah. And so they dug these into the ground, and that's what the bears lived in. It's a very unique experience, and I highly recommend you check it out if you are visiting Sitka. So the Alaska Raptor Center is another place to visit in Sitka, and you can see these rehabilitated birds as well. These are birds that were injured in the wild and have been brought to the Raptor Center with hopes of rehabilitating them and letting them out into the wild, because unlike bears, an eagle is allowed to go free again after it's been in captivity.
Yeah.
But they have really cool... There's hawks. They had a snowy owl, like Hedwig. Yeah, it was a cool place to see, and we saw a little presentation there.
Yeah, I liked when you could see where they're training the eagles.
Yes.
So it's like a long kind of a tunnel-like room that they practice attacking stuff.
Yeah, to make sure that they can survive in the wild after they've been released. It's another great cause, helping Alaskan wildlife. And then, of course, they'll tell you the horrible stories of the things that have happened to these birds to need to be rehabilitated. I remember I think it was an eagle that they said was flying and just happened to extend its wings and touch 2 power lines. Yeah. I don't think that one's going to ever be released.
No. They said because the problem, it had a balance issue. And I guess the way that birds like eagles hunt, the precision of how they hunt is so critical that if their wings don't behave in a balanced fashion, they basically can't hunt. They'll miss every time. Mm-hmm. There were others that had been hit by cars, things like that. So it's another good cause, and fun to see some birds like that up close.
And we were able to see both of these places on a bus tour that we didn't book in advance. We just went right when we landed, right when our ship arrived in Sitka. We headed to, I think it was the visitor center or something like that. And we bought, it was $3 a person to take us to just the transportation. Obviously, it was additional entrance fees to both of these places. And then from the Raptor Center, it was pretty much maybe a 1/4-mile walk to the Sitka National Historic Park.
Yeah, which we walked. I think some people took the bus, but we just walked because it was really close. Sitka National Historic Park was the site of a battle between the Tlingit people, the native people of that part of Alaska, and the Russians. It was a Russian colony at that time, Alaska. So this was sort of a colonial battle and has since been preserved as a memorial. But the other really interesting thing about the National Historic Park, at least this part of it, is that there are a lot of totem poles there. And it's not just totem poles from that part of Alaska. It was kind of this thing that happened. The U.S. preserved this park under the Antiquities Act years and years ago. And at some point, the National Park Service, I think, discovered or decided, we have all these totem poles from kind of all over. I don't know where they were. I sort of assume in my mind they were in some sort of a warehouse or something. I don't know. But they decided to put them all in this park. So there are totem poles from all over the U.S. in this sort of winding walking path. And you can see a lot of really interesting ones where we're looking at one right now where a guy has like a top hat, which is kind of cool.
Yeah. It's a really interesting kind of piece of history that you don't really get to see anywhere else in the U.S.
Definitely. It was a nice walk. I was really like a nice walk back to the main part of town from there. Wooded. We got to see the Hurtigruten cruise ship they had to tender.
Yeah, there's kind of a bay, right, that you can look at from the park, and you can see the smaller cruise ships that are tendering there. Yeah, it's a great little walk, beautiful woods. Yeah. We really enjoyed Sitka, and I feel like of all of the ports we visited on our Alaska cruise, it was one of the ones that I wanted to go back to. It felt like the most real place, where some of the other ports kind of felt like they were made for tourists. I mean, Skagway has the history there too, but what remains as the cruise ship port is cheesy and touristy. So Sitka is a really cool, unique place, and I highly recommend to visit.
That's all for today's episode of Go, See, Do, Explore. Thank you for joining us and sharing in the wonder of travel.
Keep the spirit of today's adventure alive by checking out our blog at goseedoexplore.com for even more travel inspiration.
Don't forget to rate and review us wherever you listen to your podcasts. It really helps fellow travelers find us and join our community.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep dreaming, and keep traveling by any means necessary.
I'm Christopher.
And I'm Ashleigh, bidding you farewell and happy exploring.